So our first speaker is Daniela Bleichmar, who's professor of art history and history at the University of Southern California. And I thank her in particular for leaving good weather to come to the oncoming winter. She's the founding director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities and the director of the USC Society of Fellows in the Humanities. She served as Associate Provost for Faculty and Student Initiatives in the Arts and Humanities from 2015 to 2020. Her research and teaching address the histories of art, visual and material culture, and science in colonial Latin America and early modern Europe, focusing particularly on the histories of knowledge production, cultural contact, exchange, museums, collecting and display, and books and prints. And one of the really exciting things about her work in various iterations is tracing different images as they move between maps and books and prints, which can be really laborious work, but really rewarding once you really dig into it. Her talk today is titled Mapping Space, Mapping Time, the Where and When of Indigenous History in Colonial Mexico. So please join me in welcoming Daniela.
Thank you so much for the introduction, David. Thank you so much for the invitation. I don't know if you can see me over this, I'm short. I am really, really delighted to be back at the Newbery. It's an institution I really admire and value for its collections, its exhibitions and programs, and the expertise of its fantastic curators and staff. The Newbery has tremendous holdings in cartography and in Mexican history, and I am thrilled to be part of a program that brings the two together. And I would like to begin with a map that is in the Edward E. Eyre collection. The French artist and traveler Jean-Frédéric de Waldeck painted this work in Mexico City around 1830. Here at the Newbery Library, it is part of an extensive collection of 245 original artworks that includes drawings, paintings, lithographs, as well as notes and descriptions. While the catalog record describes this painting as a, quote, Nahuatl glyph map of the Aztec migration from Aztlan to Tenochtitlan, which is a modern interpretation of its content, I am using here, can you see it? Yes. Waldeck's own description of the work, quote, the flood and confusion of languages, as recorded in a notebook here at the Newbery, labeled Catalog of Drawings, in which he kept a running list of the drawings he made in preparation for a planned work that he intended to publish but never did. Those of you familiar with Mexican colonial cartography will have already recognized Waldeck's painting as a copy of the document known to us as the Sigüenza map, an important account of Aztec history. By the time Waldeck painted this image, the Sigüenza map was already well known in Mexico and Europe through numerous copies. Indeed, the document had been reproduced so often that by 1830, it was, as far as I know, the most copied and discussed indigenous map in the colonial period and beyond. Okay. The Sigüenza map was painted by an unknown maker, likely in the late 16th or early 17th century, based on style. It is probably a copy of an earlier map, as suggested by Barbara Mundi, the distinguished historian of Mesoamerican cartography who is with us here today, and by Maria Castañeda de la Paz, who has studied this document and its history in great detail. It is painted on a mattle bark paper. This is an indigenous technology that you can explore here later today and tomorrow in the workshops that will be offered. We know it as the Sigüenza map after Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora, the new Spanish Criollo polymath who owned it in the second half of the 17th century. The document narrates the migration history of the Aztecs from their mythical origin home of Aztlan through an arduous and often dangerous peregrination until their arrival in the Valley of Mexico and foundation of the city of Tenochtitlan, which would become the capital of the Aztec Empire. Thus, although it is characterized as a map, it is more accurately described as a cartographic history, tracking human movement through space and time. This movement across space and time is depicted through a line that provides the narrative thread for this account, guiding the viewer from the upper right section of the painting to its bottom left quarter. So we start, let's see if I can use this. We start here and then move like this and around. You cannot see it, okay. Sorry, I think that the angle is a bit hard for me here, but we start here and we move like this. You see the line guiding us around on this peregrination. Sorry, I can't see. The angle is really hard. So we start at the top right, go around, and then down, and then across, and then up, and then across, and then down. This story starts in Aztlan, the mythical origin plane of the Aztecs, shown as a rectangular lake with flowing waters. An eagle perched on a tree growing on top of a hill at the center of the lake communicates with a group of ancestors. It is a manifestation of their god Huitzilopochtli, and the many comma-shaped speech clips emanating from its beak indicate it is communicating with them, instructing them to leave Aztlan to found a new home. And so they depart, beginning a peregrination that takes place over 150 years. Their march through space and time is indicated as footprints on a path, the conventional Mesoamerican pictorial rendition of travel. As they trace their path, they reach various locations where they find or establish towns, indicated and named pictographically and sometimes annotated with blue circles, each representing a year. There are about 40 toponyms in the map. Some of the place glyphs are accompanied by faint handwritten glosses in Nahuatl, which translate pictograph into alphabetic writing, and it is unclear who wrote them or when. Eventually, the elders read Chapultepec, shown prominently here, at the center of the, sorry, it's just, can you see this? No, can you see this? But you can see it, I can't. Okay, well, that's where I was trying to go. It's just, wow, we're off to a good start. It's just very angled and very bright, and so I cannot see the arrow. But I trust you that, I don't know, I can't do this like this. I'm sorry, but I need to be able to see it. Ah, yes. Okay, eventually the elders reach Chapultepec. Talk about eventually. Shown prominently at the center of the left half of the painting with a chapulín or grasshopper indicating its name. Its importance in the story is indicated by its large size, comparable to that used for the original mythical site of Aztlan. They are the only two places shown at this scale and appear almost directly aligned across the document. Chapultepec is characterized through the dramatic events that transpire once the Aztecs reach the Valley of Mexico. Bloody figures at the base of the hill indicate battles, and from there, the peregrination splits into two divergent paths, one to each side, marked initially by more bloodshed. As the narrative moves farther into the Valley of Mexico, so moving down here, the orientation of the image flips. While the top and bottom right quadrants and top left quadrant are oriented facing up, the bottom left quadrant is turned upside down. And so let's flip it so that, oh, here you see, yes. So if we flip it, we can read this last part. We can see one group split off to establish Tlatelolco, and others headed to Culhuacan, and then continue until they receive another divine message, letting them know that they had reached the site where they could establish their new home, Tenochtitlan, at the center of the watery intersection. So here. This is a historical narrative rather than a historical map, by which I mean that rather than showing us a territory as it existed at some point in the past, as a historical map does, it is a visual history that shows places that came into being as human protagonists moved across time and space, establishing towns, waging battles, responding to divine interventions. It is a charting of placemaking over time, combining history and myth. Aztec history is presented at the intersection of the where and the when, the spatial and the temporal. And this map had its own long and winding road. Its first identified owner was the Criollo polymath Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora, after whom it was later named. Sigüenza amassed a significant collection of indigenous manuscripts. There is much we don't know about the collection. There is no surviving catalog, and it had a very complex history, but we do know for certain that it included this map. Sigüenza gained a large number of documents from Juan de Alba Cortés Ixtlisochil, indigenous cacique of San Juan de Oteotihuacan, and a member of the noble family of Texcoco. These documents had been kept and passed down by the Texcoco noble family, most famously the noted intellectual and historian Fernando de Alba Ixtlisochil, and the Sigüenza map might have been, perhaps, part of this archive. After Sigüenza's death, in 1700, his collection of indigenous manuscripts went to the Jesuit College of San Pedro and San Pablo, a center of advanced education in Mexico City run by the order to which Sigüenza had once belonged. The map was then acquired by the Italian traveler Lorenzo Boturini, who collected a very large number of indigenous manuscripts during his stay in New Spain between 1736 and 43. And after it was in the hands of Boturini, it is unclear if it went to the Viceregal Palace or the Library of the University of Mexico, but it appears that in 1784, the historian Antonio de León y Gama took the manuscript, which he studied and had copied. After his death in 1802, the map went to the executor of his will, the historian José Antonio Pichardo, who held it until his own death 10 years later in 1812. Pichardo had amassed a collection of 6,000 volumes at the Jesuit Library of the Church of San Felipe Neri, known as La Profesa. And so the map was held there, and it was later purchased by Dr. José Vicente Sánchez, who donated it to the National Museum. Then around 1867 to 1871, following the French occupation of Mexico and the restoration of the Mexican national government, the map disappeared from the museum. And it went missing for almost 40 years until it resurfaced in 1904 at an antiquarian shop in Mexico City where it was offered for sale. But it was identified, investigated, and then returned to the Mexican National Museum, which later became the National Museum of Anthropology, where it remains to this day. The map was copied multiple times between the 1690s, when it was part of Sigüenza's collection, and the mid-19th century. And it was also copied many times since then, but today I'm going to focus on the earlier copies. Many of these copies were made from earlier copies rather than from the original, and I have indicated the ones that came directly from the original with an asterisk. These copies and reproductions are an index of interest. It is one thing for a document to be copied once, but for the Sigüenza map to have been copied 10 times in roughly, something happened to the numbers. Believe me, it's 10. For the Sigüenza map to have been copied 10 times in roughly 150 years indicates an enormous level of attention to this particular work. Historians tend to focus on original documents rather than copies and reproductions, especially art historians and historians of manuscripts. Copies and reproductions are sometimes mentioned in passing, particularly when they are chastised for errors or improprieties, but they're seldom studied. I have become very interested in copies, and especially copies of indigenous manuscripts. In the early modern period, copying and reproducing materials were ubiquitous epistemic practices. in painting, in manuscript, in print. Creating versions of a work involved multiple choices and decisions. It was an active, interpretive, and intellectual technique, neither mechanical nor transparent. Copying was a central part of artistic training in workshops and later in academies, and a constant practice in artistic work. Copying was also part of scholarly education and labor. Scholars read with paper and pen at hand, copying passages into commonplace books, notebooks, and slips of paper that could be reshuffled as needed for active use. They copied their notes again as they wrote letters and other texts. Copying was so prevalent that scholars, wealthy merchants, and the nobility hired assistants to handle this indispensable and laborious task. And print was, of course, a reproductive technique that allowed for the circulation of multiple copies. Original manuscripts and artworks were rare, difficult to access. Viewers in this period most often experienced work through copies. One noteworthy element of these versions of the Sigüenza map is that they were created both as manuscript copies, shown here in yellow, and as printed reproductions, shown in white. And it is not that the two are unrelated mediums. Each printed reproduction was based on a preparatory drawing or painting created for use as a source of the print. So there is a manuscript in hiding behind each original print, making the number of copies even larger. These preparatory drawings most likely did not survive the print shop. If they did, they're lost to us, but we know that they existed. Almost all of the manuscript copies were made for study. The exception is Waldeck's, who painted his version as a preparatory work for a planned publication. Manuscript copies without accompanying notes leave little, if any, trace of interpretation. It is very hard to establish who saw them and what they made of them. By contrast, all of the printed versions worked in tandem with textual descriptions and explanations, and were used to make interpretations not only of the map, but more broadly of Mexican indigenous history. So the printed reproductions allow us to access what authors made of the map, how they interpreted it, and how they used it. Some of the copies had a greater impact than others. The first reproduction of the Sigüenza map was a copper plate engraving included in the 6th volume of Giovanni Francesco Gemelli Careri's Giro del Mondo, or Voyage Round the World, printed in Naples in 1700, at the very top of the slide. Gemelli Careri's book had great success. The engraving from the first Italian edition was reprinted and included in many other versions. As many as 7 Italian editions between 1699 and 1728, 4 English editions between 1704 and 1752, 3 French editions between 1719 and 1776, as well as extracts in collections of travels in English, French, German, and Russian. So a lot of books carried this map to multiple readers. Gemelli Careri's version of the Sigüenza map also served as a source for later reproductions in 3 important and influential publications. The Ancient History of Mexico by the new Spanish Jesuit historian Francisco Javier Clavijero, number 2. Number 5, Alexander von Humboldt's View of the Cordilleras and Monuments of the Indigenous Peoples of the Americas. And number 6, Lord Gainsborough's Antiquities of Mexico. In fact, Gemelli Careri's 1700 engraving was the sole reproduction based on the original for the next 150 years, until the lithograph included in Antonio Garcia Cuba's, at the very bottom, the second number 4, Garcia Cuba's Geographical, Statistical, and Historical Atlas of the Mexican Republic, which appeared in 1858. During that century and a half, Gemelli Careri's account of the document also served as a template for its interpretation, followed by Clavijero, Humboldt, and Gainsborough. The reproduction of the Sigüenza map in Gemelli Careri's voyage was engraved in Naples, a Spanish viceroyalty at the time. It must be based on a manuscript copy that the traveler obtained in Mexico and took with him back to Italy, which was later either destroyed or lost. A substantial inscription on the left side of the image explains the copy of an ancient picture kept by Don Carlos Sigüenza, in which is drawn and described the road the ancient Mexicans traveled when they came from the mountains to inhabit the lake called at present of Mexico, with the hieroglyphics signifying the names of places and other things. And I am using here the text from the 1704 English translation. The engraving includes glosses to most of the place glyphs, providing a Nahuatl toponym and its Italian translation. Some of these inscriptions accompany glyphs that are unglossed in the original map, and some of the place names in the engraving differ from those in the painting. It is unlikely that this information came from Gemelli, who had no familiarity with Nahuatl or Mesoamerican indigenous sources. Probably the information came from Sigüenza, who shared with the Italian not only the image, but also his interpretation of it, which is rendered in the substantial accompanying text. There are differences between the engraving and the original painting. This was the norm for printed reproductions in the period. Rather than thinking of it as a problem, I think we need to focus on what it does. It is not a facsimile, it is a portrayal of the image. It is smaller in size, and certain portions have been compressed or distorted in order to accommodate the image to the copper plate, to emphasize the place glyphs by enlarging them, and to fit in the textual glosses. Some of the locations have been displaced, and some of the glyphs, engraved by an artist unfamiliar with Nahuatl pictography, have lost their coherence. The engraver likewise Europeanized the human figures and depicted them somewhat more prominently than in the painting. The printed version is tighter. It has less open space. The marshy land of the Valley of Mexico is more densely inscribed, suggesting a landscape to a greater extent than the painting does. All this said, given that the original painting is not primarily concerned with recording the exact location of sites in space, but rather with tracing a migration that combines the historical and the mythical with a rather fuzzy geography and chronology, the variations are not all that significant. The engraving appeared in the sixth part of Gemelli Carreri's Voyage Around the World, which addresses the author's travels in New Spain. An engraved portrait inserted into the first volume portrays Gemelli Carreri upon his return to Europe, elegantly dressed and fabulously bewigged, confidently holding a model of the globe he circumnavigated between 1693 and 1698. The account of the voyage follows Gemelli's movements from Naples to Egypt, Jerusalem, Constantinople, Armenia, and Georgia. This is just volume 1. And then on to Persia, India, China, and the Philippines before crossing the Pacific on the Manila Galleon. Volume 6 traces his arrival to Acapulco and voyage by land to Mexico, his stay in the Novo Hispanic capital, and travels in the Valley of Mexico, including a visit to the pyramids at Teotihuacan before heading to the port of Veracruz, and from there to Cuba, across the Atlantic, to Spain, then on to Rome, and finally back to Naples. While the contents of Gemelli Carreri's account are too extensive to address fully here, I want to mention very briefly some information that is relevant to our focus on the Sigüenza map. Gemelli's book adheres to standard patterns for educated travelers at the time. His voyage was strongly conditioned by his library. Books, and in particular earlier travel accounts, shaped his choice of destinations, his expectations, his responses, and the account he generated. The text combines what he described as his own observations and experiences with material from other authors. The narrative is structured as an itinerary, arranged by date, tracking the author's movements across space and over time. Travel combines geography and history. Lands and peoples are described with an eye to territory, contemporary society and customs, and stories about the ancient past. And a few topics receive repeated attention as he moved from region to region. Gemelli Carreri repeatedly mentioned visiting famous historical sites, particularly those connected to what were then termed antiquities. During his stay in Egypt, for instance, he made special expeditions to see ancient architectural monuments and the Great Pyramid, portrayed in engravings in the volume. Depictions of these antiquities are all set in modern times, showing fragments of ancient history as they existed when Gemelli viewed them. Gemelli was also interested in costumes and customs, particularly religious practices. This was by 1700 a well-established focus for travel accounts, a genre closely related to both cartography and costume books. The publication thus takes the stationary armchair traveler on a textual and visual voyage, putting before their eyes a servant carrying a scimitar, a woman from the seraglio, or a funerary procession in China. And all of these figures are Gemelli's contemporaries. Some of the engravings celebrate powerful rulers at the time, such as the Ottoman Sultan Ahmed II or the Grand Mogul Aurangzeb. So what happens when we get to Mexico? Gemelli's copy of the Sigüenza map is one of 14 engravings in the volume on New Spain, making it the second most illustrated of the 6 volumes. 9 of the 14 plates are devoted to antiquities or to the ancient past, a higher proportion than in any of the other volumes, and 1/10 of the plates combines the historical and the contemporary, as I will describe. Indeed, Gemelli's account of Mexico focuses on the past, and particularly on the idea of antiquity, to a much greater extent than anywhere else in the world. While in the other volumes, the narrative is firmly situated in modern times, when it comes to Mexico, much of the text addresses the history of people described as, quote, ancient Mexicans. Gemelli's New Spain is not only a geographical region, but also a historical one. It is at once a where and a when. Gemelli's account of the map aligns Aztec antiquity with biblical history. The map is interpreted as showing at top right the first man and first woman and an infant in a canoe floating in water, suggesting the biblical flood and Noah's Ark. The group gathered before a bird with speech glyphs is taken to depict the confusion of languages, followed by the scattering of humans across the earth. This interpretation was part of a long-standing effort dating back to the 16th century to incorporate this so-called New World and its people into a Christian cosmology, geography, and history. The interpretation was followed, this interpretation that this is sort of showing how the Aztecs knew of the biblical stories, was followed by later authors for over 150 years. And it was not until 1858 that the painting was understood to portray the Aztec origin myth of migration from Aztlan until the establishment of Tenochtitlan. Gemelli presents the map not as a modern source about the ancient past. He shows it as an antiquity itself. The legend engraved on the plate describes it as, quote, an ancient picture kept by Don Carlos Sigüenza. We know today that the painting was likely created at most 100 years before Gemelli saw it. We would not consider it an ancient picture. And according to period understandings, a document from 1600 would have been understood in 1700 as a modern work, not an ancient one. What interests me is not that Gemelli most likely did not know when the painting was created, but rather that Mexican indigenous antiquity was infinitely elastic, stretching from the beginning of time to the present, and at the same time almost atemporal, stuck forever in an unchanging state. The early modern obsession with the relationship between Greco-Roman ancients and European moderns was a temporal distinction, antiquity as a source of modernity, a when, not a where. But temporality and historicity were unevenly distributed across the globe. Far away was long ago, and Mexican antiquity was a where as much as a when. While other volumes portray modern rulers, the tome on New Spain includes engravings exclusively of historical figures, historical rulers, characterized as ancient Aztec kings. These engravings are also based on a historical manuscript that Sigüenza owned and made available to Gemelli Carreri, known as the Codex Ixtlilxóchitl. As with the map, Gemelli must have taken copies with him back to Europe to serve as the basis of the engraving. But something very curious happens here. The Codex Ixtlilxóchitl, sorry, the conversion of the slides messed some things up. The Codex Ixtlilxóchitl records the genealogy of the ruling house of Texcoco, not Tenochtitlan. The engravings in Gemelli's book transform Texcocan kings into Aztec ones and add a fifth figure not in the Codex Ixtlilxóchitl, that of Moctezuma. We see this as a swap, but of course for early modern viewers who did not have access to the manuscript, this would have been invisible. The plates illustrate Gemelli's account of the dynastic lineage of Aztec rulers, complementing the history presented in the Sigüenza map. So the map traces the mythical origins of the Aztecs' ancestors and culminates in the foundation of Tenochtitlan. Then the account of Aztec rulers and portraits, quote-unquote portraits, traces the rulers of Tenochtitlan until the Spanish conquest. This sequence of rulers had been a topic of interest since the 16th century, addressing multiple historical works and travel compilations. Gemelli, however, put it to different use. His interest in the chronology of rulers and in their names is connected to a second map included in the book on New Spain. Like the Sigüenza migration history, this map elides cartography and history. It presents the Valley of Mexico with a focus on orography and hydrography, mountains and waterways. It depicts the lakes, lagoons, and rivers of the intricate hydrographic system of the valley, surrounded by schematic mountains. We find at the center, okay, let's see. We find at the center of the lake or lagoon of Mexico, and to the right, the lagoon of Chalco. The island city is shown here, as are the causeways that communicated to the mainland. The map adheres to standard cartographic conventions of the time, including town and city symbols for major populations annotated with a town name, and a compass and scale prominently placed on the lake. But what appears to be a straightforward map of the modern territory, as Gemelli would have encountered it, turns out to be a moralized interpretation of the territory according to a biblical framework. There are numbers sprinkled across the map. I don't know if you can see them. There's a 10 here and here. There's a 2 here. There's a 3 here. There's a 4 here. Can you see them a little bit? Okay. One might assume that they refer to geographical elements. The textual explanation for the map, however, offers quite a different interpretation. The waterways of the Valley of Mexico, according to Gemelli Carreri, reveal the shape of a mythical beast named here as Hydrocamel, and in the legend above the map as Mexican Hydrographic Camel, which corresponds to the beast from this sea described in the book of Revelations 13, commonly interpreted as the Antichrist. The book relates the cartographic analogy. Let me show you. Can you see the animal? So this is the head, this is the eye, this is the ear, this is the collar, this is the neck, this is the body, these are the legs, 6, 6, do you see? These are the wings. The book relates the cartographic analogy to a historical one, explaining that 7 indigenous nations inhabit the valley, corresponding to the 7 heads of the beast. Here. And then below, it says there were 10 Aztec kings. That corresponds to the 10 horns of the beast. And the author goes on to show how the names of those 10 Aztec rulers add up to the number of the beast, 666. Here, 666, right? So these are the 10 rulers. and they add up to 666 if you use this complex numerological exercise where 17th century scholarship. So he says the Nahuatl has only 15 letters. And if you attribute, if you number them, and then you write Acamapichtli, Huitzi, Huitli, Chimalpopoca, Itzcoatl, Moctezuma, and you add all of this, you get to 666. So inscribed within this intricate visual and textual interpretive apparatus, Gemelli Carreri's version of the Sigüenza map becomes part of an argument about the relationship between place and time, geography and history, in which indigenous Mesoamerica is less a where than a when. The next owner, I'm going to just mention this very briefly. The next owner of the Sigüenza map, the Italian Lorenzo Boturini, put the same source to a very different use, though he shared a concern with the connections between geography and history. Boturini, also an Italian traveler, was in Mexico from 1736 to 1743. So roughly 45 years after Gemelli. During those 8 years, he managed to acquire a vast collection of indigenous paintings, maps, and manuscripts, including the materials that had belonged to Sigüenza. He seems to have been more skilled at collecting than at politics, as he got himself into such trouble that viceregal authorities had him incarcerated, seized the collection, and deported him from Mexico without the collection at the end of 1743. 3 years later, Boturini published a work that was a sum of what he had gained and lost, a result of his amazing success as a collector of indigenous material and a gambit to advance his position in the Republic of Letters and in the chutes and ladders world of imperial administration and society by putting to use the objects and ideas he had acquired in Mexico. And so this book is printed in 1746. As you will remember, by this time, Gemelli Carreri's travel account had become a bestseller and was available in multiple editions and translations. So we may see the two works as separated by 45 years, but they were really contemporary. Boturini's work consists of two parts, published together and conceived as complementary, but fully autonomous. The first is titled Idea of a New General History of North America, and he calls it an idea because he intends this as a preliminary sketch that he envisions would later give way to a full-fledged scholarly work. The frontispiece that accompanies this work addresses the relationship between time, place, the work of history, and the use of indigenous sources. At the top left of the print, we see the book's dedicatee, Philip V, first Bourbon king of Spain. To the right, putti carry his coats of arms. The portrait sits atop the Spanish imperial emblem and motto, which dates back to the reign of Charles V, 200 years earlier. The double columns representing the so-called Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, the end of the Mediterranean, and in the era of Charles V, the symbolic outer edge of the known and navigable world, a limit rendered obsolete by the ambitions in the imperial exhortation plus ultra, further beyond. This Habsburg symbol is accompanied by the Lion of Spain, and below it an assortment of armor and weapons alluding to the Spanish conquest of the Americas. In this way, the frontispiece connects two dynasties, the Habsburg and the Bourbon, eliding the rupture in rule that Philip himself had inaugurated 4 decades earlier, and connecting to different moments of imperial history, the 16th and 18th centuries, with the past providing the base upon which the present stands. In
the background, 3 ships near a coast on which 4 figures await them, gifts in hand, their feather headdresses and skirts identifying them unmistakably as so-called Indians. They are poised at the end of one chapter in history, that of pre-contact indigenous America, and the start of another. Here again, the image suggests both transition and continuity, the transfer from one regime of authority to another. The 2 scenes on either side of the composition take place in different places and at different times. The American soon-to-be imperial subjects on the right and the European imperial ruler on the left are separated not only by the Atlantic Ocean, but also by 250 years. The distance between them is both geographical and temporal. This figure traversing this space is Kronos, the personification of time, who crosses the ocean as he gazes at the royal portrait. A banderole quotes a verse from Ovid's Letters from Ponto that alludes to imperial rule. Quote, "So may Caesar guide his realm and control all lands." Kronos presents to the king nothing less than the entire world, crisscrossed by cartographic lines that measure and demarcate the landmass inscribed America, as well as the ocean inscribed Pacific Sea. So the allegorical frontispiece to this new general history communicates that history is an imperial subject and one that has to do with both time and place, inseparable coordinates. The title page announces that the publication is based on, quote, based on copious materials of figures, symbols, characters, and hieroglyphics, songs, and manuscripts of Indian authors recently discovered. And it's notable that the word author does not refer to Boturini, but to Native Americans, and that it refers not only to text, but primarily and overwhelmingly to pictorial sources. And it is these pictorial sources, the collection of indigenous manuscripts gathered by Sigüenza y Góngora and then Boturini, that are the subject of the second part of the work. It is entitled Catalogue of the Historic Indian Museum. And it announces Boturini's, quote, literary treasure, which can be used to organize and write the general history of the New World, founded on the indisputable monuments of the Indians themselves. The indisputable monuments are these manuscript sources. Boturini's method and historiographical position have been described as shocking in their attitude towards indigenous sources. Boturini proposed that the Amerindians had books equivalent to Ovid and Virgil, as well as the tales of their own Ulysses and Hercules, and that these could be interpreted to reconstruct the past. His approach was informed by the latest historiographical debates in Europe, and particularly in the Hispanic world, where, as historian Jorge Cañizares-Esguerra has shown, scholars, lawyers, and thinkers involved with both the study and the governance of the Spanish Indies criticized earlier histories of the region and explored new methods for historical work, producing a bounty of scholarship and creating new major institutions such as the Archivo General de Indias, the General Archive of the Indies. Boturini also drew heavily on the work of Giambattista Vico, which he stood on its head. While Vico had denied the validity of non-Western pictorial evidence, Boturini instead claimed that the historical records of the Amerindians of Mexico were among the richest ever assembled by any people in history. They were accurate, reliable, voluminous, and seemed to confirm, as we saw, every single detail of the biblical narrative, including Genesis, the flood, the diaspora after the destruction of the Tower of Babel. That is what the Sigüenza map was taken to show. Boturini claimed to have gathered about 500 painted documents, maps, and manuscripts produced by indigenous writers and painters, both before and after the conquest. The historian John Glass described Boturini's Indian Museum as, quote, the most important collection of Indian manuscripts for ancient Mexican history ever gathered by a single individual. There is to this day no comparable archive anywhere in the world. And the catalog as I hope you can see, is 95 pages long. It is organized by indigenous nation. So what we saw with Gemelli, where the Texcocan kings become the Aztec kings, there's none of that here. The organization of the collection is people, nation by nation. Maps are central sources for indigenous history. They are the first set of documents for each section. And the Sigüenza map appears on the section on Mexican maps, which you can see here. For Boturini, the implications of his Indian museum were enormous. The idea opens with a chapter in which he proposed that the history of New Spain could, quote, not only compete with the most celebrated in the world, but also excel them. And he listed 4 reasons for this supremacy. First, New Spain possessed the most abundant archive, including, above all, quote, figures, symbols, characters, and hieroglyphs, which encompass in themselves a vast amount of learning. That is the English translation of the modern edition. The Spanish is much more vivid. Un mar de erudición, a sea of erudition, an ocean of erudition. Second, indigenous culture had, quote, a chronology so precise that in its skill, it surpasses that of the Egyptians and Chaldeans, based on their exacting astronomical knowledge, quote, a perpetual and unfailing system, which is the most genuine property of true science. Third, their sophisticated chronology was matched by superb geographical knowledge. It is a wonderful thing, he enthused, to see the kingdoms, provinces, cities, and lands of each people with mountains, water, and everything necessary for sustenance drawn on the pictorial documents of the Indians. And the fourth reason he cited was the accuracy, precision, and reliability of the sources based on the excellence of indigenous historical tradition. Even more outstanding, he considered, is the truth and simplicity with which the ancient historians, both in pictures and in songs, mentioned things worth remembering. They painted the events with the greatest precision and enormous detail. So the 4 aspects that Boturini singled out as especially important were, number 1, indigenous knowledge as expressed through their paintings. Number 2, chronology, time. Number 3, geography, place. And number 4, reliability. What made this archive interesting and important, according to Boturini, was that indigenous historians had truthfully recorded the when and the where of history. Boturini never wrote his general history of North America based on indigenous manuscripts. Over the second half of the 18th century, Criollo intellectuals in New Spain pored over the documents of what had been his collection, creating their own copies and studies. In the early decades of the 19th century, New World antiquarianism became a phenomenon. Alexander von Humboldt's view of the Cordilleras and monuments of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, published in Paris between 1810 and 13, was particularly influential and continued the long connection between American geography and history by juxtaposing new natural landmarks and geographical sites with indigenous ruins and antiquities. As you page through the book, you have where, when, where, when. They are always in dialogue. In Mexico City, in the 1820s, the French traveling artist Jean-Frédéric Waldeck found himself in a newly independent nation, no longer New Spain, and just recently renamed Mexico after the Mexica or Aztecs. He painted this copy not from the original, but from another copy, among many other works that he planned to include in a publication of lithographs. And the title he chose for the project, Mexico, Ancient and Modern. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniela. now is the time for questions. So please text the number that's in your folder. Any questions you have? I don't trust you to give you the microphone. And it's better with the Zoom people. But no, it's okay. One question we had was, how do you explain the upside, I assume upside down sections of the Sigüenza map? Were viewers meant to walk around the map? How is it?
Yeah, is this still on? Yes? Yeah, it's a very good question. And to be honest, I am not sure, and I am not the right person to answer that question. I'm going to leave it at that. Yeah, I don't know enough yet.
If people are having trouble with I can use the microphone if you're having trouble with the texting. Oh, yeah.
I did text my question, but I was wondering if the glyphs are mythic places or...
Yeah, so the glyphs are very complex. Maria Castañeda de la Paz is a person who has really studied this in detail. Some of them are recognizable as like towns, and of course Tenochtitlan, and sites, Chapultepec, other ones, and some of them have not been related to places and appear to be mythical. When I said that the geography and chronology are very fuzzy, what I meant is that this image combines both places in the land and places in myth, and time, human time, but also mythical time. So it's a geography and a history that adheres to its own logic of both geography and history.
We had a couple questions on some of the other symbols and depictions. One has to do with what the grasshopper symbolizes.
The grasshopper is a place glyph, like all of you see the glyphs for town, which is Aldepetl, the mountains. Sorry, so they look green in the Valdec copy. Do you see that this is a repeated? So that means Aldepetl mountain, and it means a town or a city. And then Chapultepec is, Chapulín is the grasshopper, and it's the place name. It's the site of the grasshopper.
And there was another question about the depiction of Hercules in the fall of Babel.
What is the question?
Just, can you talk more about the depiction of Hercules in the fall of Babel?
I don't know what they mean by Hercules.
That's all.
Yeah, I know. I
All right.
I don't understand the question.
If whoever asks that question can...
I'm sorry?
I was just saying, if whoever asked that question can... But Leah can...
Oh, thank you for asking a question I don't understand, Leah.
Thank you, Daniela, for this beautiful talk tracing the reception of this important map. And I think what interested me most was this important point you're making about, and I'm going to try to quote you here about thinking about Mexico as an ancient place rather than as an ethnographic place in Gemelli, Carreri, and also, I guess, in Botterini, how the other representations of places are more ethnographic. but when he turns to Mexico, it becomes ancient, it becomes biblical. So I wonder if you could speak more about this. Is this a phenomenon that's just happening with this map, or are you finding this as a widespread phenomenon? Is it earlier? Does it continue into the 19th century?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, that is what really interests me, as you can tell, how these sources about place are also sources about time and how they have been used. Can you hear me? How they have been used at different moments to create different stories. So we use this, well, not this, but the original now as a source that tells a certain story, but that is a very recent interpretation if you consider 1858 recent. But for centuries before, this image had an entirely different meaning, and it was examined over and over and over by many, many, many people, some of them authors of important works that had a huge impact of the understanding of New Spain and then Mexico, both as a viceroyalty and an imperial territory, but also then as a modern independent nation. And these indigenous sources have been used in those very, very active ways. Leah, as you were mentioning, it was really interesting to me what happens when you look at the image not in isolation, but as part of a narrative, right? In an article, Barbara, who is around here somewhere, has this great phrase where she says that one of the hardest thing to get at is, I forget exactly how it's worded, but is what people made of these things, right? And so as a historian, I get very excited when I find sources that give me an in into what people actually made of them. Because if we only think about them in the present as what we make of them, we are ignoring their own biographies, their own interpretive lives over the centuries. And so, Jamali Karari's book is about 2,500 pages long. It's 6 volumes. But it's really striking how he goes around the world, and in every place he goes, he's in the present, right? He's like, I am here. He's like, and then I got a guide and went to the Great Pyramid in Egypt, and it's an ancient monument, and there I was looking at it. And so the narrative is in the present time. And then you get to Mexico, right? The rulers, right? He's like, I was in, here's a great, here's a sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And it's a sultan who was in power when Jamali Karari was in Istanbul, right? Here is the Grand Mogul, and it is the Mogul who was a contemporary, a modern person in the 17th century. And then he gets to New Spain, and we're in ancient times. And the text does this super interesting thing where he's like, he's in the present, but the chapters alternate much more than anywhere else in the world between his life as a traveler in Mexico City and accounts of the past. So you, for the first time in 6 volumes, you have these chapters that are entirely set in the past, in ancient times. So I think it's very specific and very unique. I think it is part of, I've been talking about originals and copies, and it is a culture of copy. Jamali is not original. He is representative of an entire approach to travel writing, to history. One of the sources he cites constantly in Mexico is José de Acosta, a history of the Indies from 1590, right? So 100 years later. And it's so interesting because he's citing Acosta as a modern, as a contemporary, and he's looking at a map made exactly around that time and saying, this is ancient. And so there's a lot of moves that result in indigenous objects and indigenous stories being always ancient for Gemelli and his contemporaries and an undistinguished ancient, right? Meaning that some of the Texcocan kings or the Aztec kings shown were from the 16th century. So indigenous kings in the 16th century are ancient, just like the pyramids of Egypt are ancient. So it serves very specific purposes of historians, but I do think that Mexico or New Spain becomes, in this period, the place of antiquity in a way that no other place is. I mean, and sorry, I'll shut up after this, but it's also really striking that, you know, by the time Valdec is there, like 1830, right, the Independence War ends in 1821, right? The first time he goes to New Spain, and then he goes to, is no longer New Spain, and the country names itself Mexico after the Mexica, right? I mean, this is just a few decades after this country named itself not after any of its, you know, native nations or First Peoples, but United States of America. And Mexico is saying, we are the inheritors of the Mexica, not of the Texcocans, Tlatelolcans, Mixtecs, you know. So the appropriation of the past for the purposes of the present is something that keeps happening.
Can you talk a little bit more about how Boturini connected the biblical stories like the Tower of Babel and Hercules with Mexican mythology?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is, so again, this is a very long-standing scholarly and intellectual project. Acosta is central to it. In the 16th century, there's this problem of what happens when you have populations that were not part of the ecumeny of the, you know, known world, inhabitable world, that are not part of known history, and that don't seem to be included in sort of a Christian cosmology. And so there's this huge intellectual project of translation and compagination, of making these new lands and new peoples compatible with European cosmology. And one of the ways to do it is by saying there's signs in the Americas of Christianity, even if the people who lived there did not know it, right? So for example, and these are found everywhere, and they are found in nature, right? The passion flower, which is from Peru. My students, when I talk about this, they always think it's called a passion flower because it makes you passionate or something. Passion fruit, it's a passion of Christ, right? And when missionaries saw the passion flower that has, you know, they did a Christian reading of the morphology, and they were like, oh yes, it has the nails, like the nails with which Christ is the passion of Christ. So they read every part of the flower as a Christian element, as a you know, sort of demonstration of Christianity in the New World. And they interpreted indigenous sources in this way. So when Boturini is receiving this from Gemelli, Careri, from, I mean, the interpretation that this is a biblical origin story is current from the first interpretation that I know of is the one that is published in Gemelli Careri in 1700, and it's not until 1858 when it is revised. So it's dominant.
Okay, thank
Barbara
you. You can ask.
Can Barbara ask her question, or are we entirely out of time?
Okay, Barbara can ask a question. But only because she's Barbara.
I mean, she really is a VIP of Mexican cartography, so come on.
But for everyone else, you can always corner Daniela at the coffee table.
Thank you. This is such a fabulous talk. I love your reading of this and the placing of it in this intellectual European world, which is a product of a European historiography that is both fictitious and enabling. It's fictitious in that it erases a kind of indigenous past, sets it as ancient. What does that history then enable?
I mean, it sounds like you have the answer.
No, I've always wondered because I look at these 18th and 19th century, and that's not my field at all. And I'm thinking, well, what's the end point of this historiographic trajectory? It's a little bit speculative, but where does it get us?
I mean, I think it sounds like you have an idea of what this.
No, I don't know. I'm just thinking, like, where does this all end?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a very good question. I mean, I guess honestly, I feel like it hasn't ended. I've been having these conversations. We have somebody here who is a museum curator, and I've been having these conversations with friends who are curators in museums, and their departments are called Ancient Americas and have been renamed Ancient Americas. And they include objects that are ancient, but they include 16th century objects. And so I've been saying, like, what? Like, does that not bother you that it's called Ancient Americas? And they're like, well, we don't want to call it pre-Columbian. Right? And I'm like, I understand that, but given this history, right, I'm an early modernist, given the history that insisted that Mesoamerican indigenous people were always and forever ancient, right, that there was no distinction between the 16th century and who knows when, right, the distinction that for us, right, we have a before and after, right, we have a sort of prelapsarian and post-lapsarian periodization, where we're like before the European incursion, after. That distinction was invisible to anyone who wrote about these manuscripts until well into the 19th century. They did not see that. For us, we see the Mapa de Sigüenza, and we're like, this is obviously after. That was invisible to them. So, given that history, for me, it is really important to insist on the historicity of indigenous populations across time, right? Not that these are people with temporality. And it's interesting, I've had very interesting conversations with colleagues who work on indigenous studies in the US, which is, of course, talk about mythical geographies, right? The US, Anglophone US is not a geography that makes sense for indigenous histories of North America, but they say, oh, we have the opposite problem. If Aztecs are always and forever unchangingly ancient, North American indigenous populations never have a history, right? And so I feel like history, that's why, if you will excuse me, in a meeting on the history of cartography, I talked the entire time about history, because I think that history is so central to this, and that history, both the denial of coevalness, right, the denial that these people are our contemporaries, the denial of historicity, these people have a history, the denial of temporality, these people change over time, is sort of the crux of the intellectual problem for me of what we do. Thank you, that was a fabulous question.
All right, can we thank Daniela?